Picture this, it's late at night, a dark street, an empty parking lot, police lights on the horizon, and it all happens in a matter of seconds. A racist cop suddenly pulls over a pregnant black woman. He doesn't ask questions, doesn't understand the situation, and instead, he strikes. But he doesn't know it yet. He just raised his hand against one of the most powerful men in this city, the new judge. Hello, friends, right now, write in the comments your name and where you are watching this video from. We really appreciate each of you. You are incredibly important to us and to the promotion of our channel. Thanks to you, we can tell such stories and open our eyes to injustice. You are our inspiration, and together we can make this world a better place. Enjoy watching. The night was thick, the air heavy as if before a storm. There was not a soul on the deserted street, except for a lonely woman who was slowly walking to her car. Her belly was already noticeably rounded. She was carrying a new life under her heart. At that moment she felt vulnerable, but she never for a second imagined that what would happen in a moment would change everything. A patrol car emerged from the darkness like a predator. Its headlights picked the woman out of the night, as if accusing her of something invisible. The policeman stepped out of the car slowly. His face was distorted with undisguised hostility. It was a look she had seen too many times, the look of a man who considered himself superior to others, a man who was sure he could do whatever he wanted with impunity. "What are you doing here?" His voice was cold, almost venomous. He didn't ask her how she was feeling or if she needed help. No, to him she was just another black woman, whom he assumed was a criminal by default. "I'm just walking to my car," she said, trying to sound calm despite the growing tension, but that wasn't enough for him. His steps quickened, and his hand was already on his gun holster. "Papers," he barked, not giving her time to even get her bag out. His eyes were blazing with anger, fueled by years of hatred and prejudice. He was used to his word being law, and he wasn't even going to listen to her. As she reached for her ID, the police officer did something she hadn't expected. He stepped forward and punched her. Pain shot through her body, and she staggered, instinctively clutching her stomach, trying to protect her unborn child. The seconds dragged on endlessly, as if the whole world had frozen in that moment. The moment the policeman's fist crashed into her body, everything happened in slow motion. The air seemed to escape from her lungs with a painful whistle. Shock mixed with pain, and she instinctively grabbed her stomach, as if trying to protect not only herself, but her child as well. One question was ringing in her head: why? The policeman stood over her, not pausing for a moment, his fists clenched as if ready to strike again. There was no remorse in his eyes, only cold, unfeeling contempt. His prejudice was so deeply rooted that he saw her not as a woman, not as a person, but simply as a target for his hatred. She was choking with pain, not only physical but also mental. Every nerve in her body screamed in horror, because she was not only afraid for herself, but also for the life inside her. Inside her, a small heart was beating, which could stop at any moment because of the ruthlessness of this man. Her hands were shaking when she tried to get up from the asphalt, but her legs did not obey. The blow was too strong. The fear was too great. She could not believe that all this was happening to her, at this very moment when she should have felt the safest. The policeman, as if enjoying his action, stepped back and looked around. The street was empty, no one around. For him, it was the perfect scenario. No one would see, no one would judge. He, like many others, had grown accustomed to the fact that his power was unlimited, and that any black life could be blamed simply because of the color of its skin. He was confident in his immunity. "Get up," he shouted harshly, but there was no sympathy in his voice. It was an order, not caring that she was pregnant, that she could lose the baby at that moment. It didn't matter to him. She was not human to him. She tried to get up, but her legs were buckling, pain was running through her body, and tears were choking her, blurring her vision. Fear gripped her so tightly that it seemed like everything that was happening was a nightmare from which it was impossible to wake up. She couldn't understand how someone could do this to another person, how someone could use force so easily, without thinking about the consequences. Her world collapsed at that moment like a house of cards, but she knew that she had to fight, had to stand for the sake of the one inside her. Only at that moment did she become truly afraid for the life of her child. Her body shook with pain, but one question still pounded in her head. Why? How could he do this? She looked up at the policeman. There was nothing human in his face. It was a mask of power and hatred that seemed to erase all traces of compassion from him. "Why did you do this?" Her voice broke, barely audible, saturated with pain and fear. She held her stomach, trying to somehow protect her child, but there was no sympathy or regret in the policeman's eyes. The policeman looked down at her with the same cold confidence as before, as if she were just a piece of dirt under his feet. "You think I'm going to explain myself to you?" he sneered, stepping closer, his boots hitting the asphalt hard, bringing his massive figure closer. "I'm here to maintain order, and people like you are always disrupting it." His words cut her like a knife. He didn't even try to find out who she was. To him, she was just another problem to be suppressed. Her whole being screamed that this was unfair, but her voice was too weak against a system that had spent years telling people like him that they could do whatever they wanted. "Please. I'm pregnant," she whispered, feeling a tear running down her cheek. She tried to get up, but the pain in her stomach increased with every movement. "You could hurt my baby." These words seemed to stop him for a moment. His gaze dropped to her rounded belly. But what would have aroused sympathy in any normal person, for him was just a new obstacle in the way of his power. "Pregnant, huh?" he said coldly, as if weighing his actions. Then he leaned closer, his face dangerously close to hers. "Maybe this baby will be like you. Then I'll know I'm doing the city a favor." The words came out of nowhere. There was no hesitation or doubt in his voice. Each word was filled with hatred, cold and vicious, directed not only at her, but at the life she carried beneath her heart. Her breathing quickened, fear gripped her mind, but something inside her began to grow, not just fear for her life, but an unbearable sense of injustice. This was more than just an insult or a blow. This was an attack on everything she was, and everything she stood for. She looked at him, her face twisted in pain, but there was a fire in her eyes now. She was no longer just afraid for her life. She realized that she had to fight, that she could not allow him to destroy her dignity and the future of her child. "You have no idea what you're doing," she said through the pain, gathering all the strength she had left. "You don't know who I am." The policeman grinned again, his lips twisting into a mocking grimace. "I don't care who you are," he said with cruel calm. "You are nothing to me. And you will always be nothing." The words echoed in her head. But she knew it wasn't over. Somewhere inside her, there was strength, hidden beneath the layers of fear and pain. She struggled to her feet, despite her body's protests, and stood as straight as she could, trying not to show weakness in front of him. "You will remember this," she said, her voice even, but no longer fearful. "Very soon you will understand how wrong you were." The policeman snorted and turned away, thinking it was just another empty attack. He didn't know that a few hours later his world would be turned upside down when he realized who he had raised his hand against. The policeman chuckled again, his smile almost feral, as if he was enjoying his power over the helpless woman. Her words had no effect on him. He didn't believe in consequences. To him, she was just another black woman on whom he could take out his prejudices. And so he took another step forward, as if he was going to strike again, as if the pleasure of the pain he was inflicting was not enough. "Are you still standing? I wonder." He spoke slowly, drawing out the words like a predator playing with its prey. "Maybe I should try harder. Maybe this time you won't be able to get up." She took a step back, instinctively trying to retreat, but every step was followed by a sharp pain in her stomach. Panic was spreading inside her like a toxic fog, making it hard to breathe. Everything was mixed up in her head: pain, fear for her child, horror that this man could kill her right here, on a deserted street where no one would come to help. "Please, stop." Her voice shook, but she tried to remain calm, although a wave of panic was tormenting her inside. "I didn't do anything. You can't do this. I can't." He grinned even wider, a glint of madness in his eyes. "I can do whatever I want. And no one can stop me. Especially not someone like you." The words struck her like lightning. She was a woman, a mother-to-be, and a judge who had dedicated her life to justice. But now, in this moment, her status meant nothing to this man. To him, she was nothing more than a target, and every breath she took was a challenge he was determined to crush. "Just look at yourself," he continued, moving closer and closer to her. "Do you think your child will change anything? Do you think he will be better than you?" Her body began to shake, not from the cold, but from fear. She felt her heart pounding, everything inside her cracking with tension. At that moment, she realized that her child might not survive if this nightmare did not end. Dark thoughts flashed through her head, images of what could happen. She was on the ground, unconscious, her child, for whom she had fought so hard, no longer breathing. The policeman grabbed her arm, and pain shot through her body again, as if he had hit her again. But this time it was not just physical pain, it was humiliation, a betrayal of the very system she believed in. "You just can't understand how this world works, can you?" His voice was poisonous, like a cold wind tearing at her hopes. "You're not important. And neither is your child. You're just trash in this country." Her heart sank. The words cut deeper than any blow. She knew he didn't just hate her, he hated her existence, her right to live. He believed her life was worthless, that she and her child were statistics that didn't matter. She tried to pull away again, her breathing ragged, her vision blurred with tears, but her mind was beginning to clear. A thought flashed through her mind: this wasn't just a random attack, this was an act of cruelty driven by hatred. And she couldn't let him win. Her child deserved a chance to live. "You think I'm unimportant," she said, clenching her teeth to keep the pain inside. "But you're wrong. You have no idea what will happen when people find out what you've done." "People?" His grin grew even more venomous. "What people?" "No one will know. No one will listen to you when you say it was me. Because I am the law here." Her heart began to beat fast again, but this time it was not from fear, but from anger. She felt a wave of rage rising inside her, sweeping away the last of her weakness and fear. She could not allow this man to destroy her and her child. She could not allow him to continue to live believing that he was untouchable. "No." She straightened up despite the pain, her eyes meeting his. "You're not the law. You're just a coward hiding behind a badge." His eyes flashed with rage and he grabbed her shoulder again, squeezing so hard she could barely breathe. He leaned down to her face, almost hissing with anger. "You know nothing," he hissed. "You are nobody." She already felt that her strength was leaving her, that the pain was becoming unbearable. But at that moment, when it seemed that her world was collapsing, she felt a small push inside her, a weak movement of a child, as a sign that not all was lost. Her eyes filled with tears, but they were not tears of fear, but of determination. Her heart sank as the policeman grabbed her shoulder again. He had a smirk on his face, and there was no hint of remorse in his eyes. "You're nobody." The words echoed in her head, growing louder with each passing second, filling her consciousness threateningly. "You're nobody." Her body trembled with fear. The policeman leaned closer, his breath, smelling of cigarettes and anger, burning her cheek. She felt his grip tighten, as if he intended to crush her not only physically but also mentally, to erase her presence in this world completely. His fingers dug into her shoulder with such force that it seemed he could break her bones at any moment. "You think anyone will believe you?" His voice was hoarse, almost hissing. It was as if he was breaking into every word, like an animal ready to pounce. "You are nothing. To everyone, you are just another black woman who was in the wrong place at the wrong time." The words he spoke were more than just insults. They tore at her soul, each word piercing her heart like a knife. Her whole being screamed in fear. He was sure that he was untouchable, that his strength and power would allow him to get away with it. And he played on this, enjoying the fact that she was in his arms, scared, vulnerable, with a child under her heart, unable to protect herself. "Please, don't." Her voice shook, broken by sobs. She knew she couldn't let him continue, but fear for the child paralyzed her. Every movement sent a sharp pain through her stomach, as if her body no longer obeyed her. She felt tears streaming down her cheeks, washing away the last remnants of resistance. "Please, you think that will change anything?" The policeman chuckled again, his eyes glittering in the darkness. "Your requests don't matter. No one will come to your aid. No one will see what I've done." Her heart was beating so fast it felt like it would burst. She looked around, the empty street, the dark windows, the indifference of the night. No one would come out. No one would see. No one would help. Her world had shrunk to a single point, this man who held her in his arms. He was the embodiment of all her fears, a system that could break her, not noticing that it was destroying lives. In that moment, she truly felt like a nobody. But inside her, Another heart was still beating, small and fragile, but alive. A baby that was moving despite everything that was happening. Every kick in her belly was a reminder that she had to fight. She had to endure, not for herself, but for this new life. The policeman, seeing that she was not resisting, grinned again. He already considered her defeated. "That's better. See, you already know your place." He relaxed his grip, but didn't back down. He seemed to enjoy watching her tremble before him. But she couldn't just give in. Pain, fear, and humiliation mingled inside her, creating a potent mixture that made her slowly raise her eyes to him. There was desperation in her gaze, but there was something else too, something this man couldn't understand. She knew he didn't realize his actions would have consequences, that this night would change his life. But for now, she was alone against his rage. "You can't get away from this," she whispered, her voice shaking but with determination. "You don't know who you're dealing with." The policeman snorted derisively, stepping closer again. Now he towering over her, like a giant over a small figure he considered insignificant. "Contact? Ha, you made me laugh." He leaned even closer, his face inches from hers. "I can do whatever I want to you, and you won't be able to prove a thing. You'll just be another one of those people who disappears without a trace. People like you disappear every day, and no one asks questions." At that moment, her heart sank with terror. Those words spoke her worst fear, that she could simply disappear, become another victim, and no one would know the truth. The fear grew inside her, like a drawn-out scream that could not be released. All she could do was continue to hope for a miracle, for salvation that seemed impossible. Her voice broke. "You won't get away with it. You can't do this. I can do whatever I want." His voice became low, threatening. "And you don't even know the name of the one who will destroy you." He reached for her face again, but at that moment something inside her snapped. It wasn't just fear, but also a desire to protect her child. She understood that the only person who could save her now was herself. He stood over her, looming like the shadow of the oppression that had haunted her people for centuries. Every word, every gesture was laced with contempt, as if her life and her pain were worth nothing in his eyes. This was racism in its most brutal and ugly form, not just a personal hatred but a reflection of an entire system built on inequality and prejudice, and she felt it in every cell of her body. He wasn't just a man with prejudices, he was the face of a system that had been stealing the lives and hopes of people like her for centuries. There was no humanity in his eyes, only an icy certainty that her life was worthless. She realized it with every passing second, and the fear bit into her like an icy knife. The policeman raised his hand again, slowly, as if savoring the moment. He knew she would be unable to resist, that every attempt to say or do anything would be met with his fist and his taunts. "Have you ever thought you could be something else? Important?" He said it mockingly. "People like you should not be mistaken. You have always been at the bottom, and there you will remain. We will always be at the top." Her heart sank painfully. The words were more than an insult. They were an admission that to him and to people like him, her life and the life of her child meant nothing. He saw her as nothing more than a symbol of something he could oppress, suppress, and humiliate with impunity. He was part of a system that had oppressed her people for so long, and he knew it. He felt his power, his absolute impunity. "You know what's most interesting?" He leaned slowly towards her face, so close that she could smell his foul breath. "You think that everything has changed, that you have gained freedom, equal rights, but it's all a lie. Nothing has changed, and nothing will ever change." Those words hit her harder than any physical blow could. He was sure that his truth was the only truth, that the system would always be on his side, that those he hated would forever be under his thumb. To him, she was the embodiment of all the hatred he had carried inside him all his life. Not a person, but a symbol of his superiority. Her head began to spin. Her breathing became heavy and ragged. The pain in her stomach grew stronger, and fear for her child pierced her very heart. But something inside her began to change. It wasn't just physical pain or fear, it was the realization that before her stood a man who embodied everything her people had fought against for so long. She felt the anger rise in her chest. This anger wasn't new. It was old, built up over generations, for every mother who had lost her children to violence, for every person who had been wrongfully arrested, beaten, or killed simply because of the color of their skin, for every black life that had been cut short by the violence of those who thought they were above the law. This anger, suppressed for so long, was now rising like a wave. "You can't do this," she whispered, her voice weak, but there was no fear in it anymore. Only determination. You think you can destroy us, but you're wrong. The policeman stopped, his face twisted for a moment in confusion. He hadn't expected her to be able to say anything back. To him, she was supposed to be broken, defeated. What? He leaned toward her again, his eyes blazing with fury. Did you say something? You're wrong. Her voice grew firmer. She no longer looked at him as a monster, but as a man whose hatred was fueled by lies. We won't break. We're stronger than you think. My child will live, and no one will be able to stop it. Are you completely crazy? The policeman laughed, but there was no longer the same confidence in his voice. You are a nobody, and your child will be a nobody. No. Her eyes flashed with an anger he hadn't expected to see. You don't understand that you've already lost. You think that the power is in your fist, in your badge, but the truth is stronger than you. Justice is stronger. The policeman clenched his fists, his face red with anger. He took a step toward her, ready to hit her again, but at that moment something stopped him. There was a noise in the distance, and a moment later bright headlights illuminated the street. A patrol car had pulled up. His confidence wavered, but hatred still boiled in his eyes. This is not the end, he hissed, stepping back. I will find a way. You will regret ever daring to contradict me. But she didn't feel afraid anymore. Yes, the pain hadn't left her body yet. The fear for her child was still there. But now she knew she wasn't alone. This policeman, this symbol of hatred and racism, thought he could break her, but he didn't know that her strength was in the fact that she wasn't alone. The policeman stood, his eyes blazing with hatred, his fists clenched so hard his knuckles turned white. The anger that boiled within him was ancient, as old as society itself, steeped in lies of superiority. He looked at her as a target for his prejudices, as a symbol of all those he hated simply for existing. You don't understand? His voice cut through the silence again, louder, rougher now. You and your kind, you've always been nothing, always will be below, and I am the law, and I can suppress the likes of you, beat, destroy. These words were not just empty threats. They were like cold water, chilling the soul. There was real rage in his voice, fed from the dark depths of hatred that had lived in the hearts of those who thought themselves superior for centuries. To him, she was the embodiment of all his fears that the world might change, that she, like her, could stand equal to him, or even higher. This was a threat to his power, and he responded to it as a savage responds to a threat to his position. He stepped forward, raising his fist again. She had just managed to cover her face with her hands, instinctively protecting herself. When his hand shot forward, the blow landed on the side of her head, and she almost lost consciousness from the sharp pain. The ground seemed to disappear from under her feet, her body collapsing onto the pavement like a rag doll. The pain was unbearable. Her eyes shimmered with tears, blurring her vision, but through the fog she saw only his face, his cold, contemptuous eyes that seemed like two wells of darkness. He enjoyed it. He enjoyed watching her fall before him. You said something about justice? He leaned over, hands on his hips, as if this was his victory lap. Where is it now? Where are these rights of yours? Where are these people who are supposed to protect you? Black, pregnant. Who thinks people like you are important? The words cut like a knife, penetrating her soul deeper than the blow itself. This was not just one man committing atrocity. This was the voice of a system that had always told her that her life, and the lives of people like her, had no place in this world. He spoke not only for himself, but for all those who had told her people for centuries that they were nothing. You think being a judge is going to change anything? He continued, his voice growing more venomous. You think you can be more than just another black woman asking for pity? No. The system is on my side. The law is on my side. And you'll always be where you belong. In the dirt. Her heart was beating so hard it felt like it was going to burst out of her chest. The pain in her stomach was becoming unbearable. She felt the baby kick again, reminding her of his presence, of the life inside her that this man was ready to destroy without mercy. Her breathing became ragged, each breath difficult. The world around her was narrowing to a single point to this moment when her life hung by a thread. She tried to stand up, but her legs wouldn't obey her, her head was spinning, and the world around her was swimming before her eyes. Her whole body was screaming that she couldn't bear this horror any longer. She was afraid not only for herself, but for the life she carried inside, for that innocent soul that hadn't yet seen this world, but was already on the brink of death because of the hatred accumulated over generations. The policeman took another step toward her, his heavy boots thumping on the asphalt. He was like a predator closing in on his prey, fully confident that nothing could stop him. "You know that no one will save you. No one." His voice was filled with mockery. "All your protests, your cries for equality, it's all empty talk. This world belongs to people like me. And you will be just another statistic that will be forgotten in a day." Her body shook with fear, but something new was brewing in her heart: anger. Anger that replaced her terror like a fire fanned by the wind. It wasn't just fear of him, of his fists and his taunts. It was anger at the entire system that allowed people like him to believe they were above the law. Anger for every woman who had been abused, for every child whose life had been ruined by racism. "You cannot defeat us." Her voice broke, but there was a firmness in it that surprised even her. "You think that your hatred makes you stronger. But we live in spite of it. And we will always fight." The policeman stopped, his face twisted in rage. He hadn't expected her to speak again. He had wanted to see fear, tears, pleading, but instead her words hit him like blows. He lifted his foot sharply and kicked her in the side. "You still dare to speak? After all this," he shouted, his voice filled with rage that was already beyond the bounds of rationality. "I'll show you what happens to people like you when they dare to contradict." Her body shook from the impact, the pain rolling over her like a wave, almost knocking her breath out of her. But even in this state, even when everything was swimming before her eyes, she did not allow herself to remain silent. "We will always fight." Her words cut through him again. This policeman, like so many before him, was used to being silenced by fear. Used to having untouchable power. But now, lying on the pavement in front of him, was not just a woman. She was a symbol of what he feared most of all: change. The moment she said those words, the policeman's anger reached its limit. He leaned down to grab her hair, but at that very moment, another patrol car pulled up. Flashing lights and sirens filled the air, as if fate itself had decided to intervene in this violent scene. "What's going on here?" another policeman exclaimed, jumping out of his car with a serious expression on his face. His eyes quickly scanned the scene, a pregnant woman lying on the ground, and his partner standing over her, a threat in his eyes. "That black liar broke the law," the racist responded furiously, not wanting to give in. She was in the wrong place at the wrong time. However, the second policeman, whose name was Daniel, ran closer and began to examine the woman. Her body was mutilated and her eyes were full of fear. Confusion was growing in his soul, and he felt that something was wrong here. "Hey, are you okay?" His voice was filled with genuine concern. He leaned down to help her up and saw her hand reaching for her stomach. "My child," she said, barely holding back tears. "I'm scared. He might get hurt." Daniel slowly turned to face his partner, and his expression changed. He saw in the racist's eyes what he himself hated: hatred and contempt that were used to justify cruelty. "You shouldn't have done that," Daniel said, not hiding his indignation. "She's pregnant. You have no right to hit her." The racist stirred, his rage returning with renewed vigor, as if someone had stabbed him in the heart. He had never thought that any of his colleagues would dare challenge his authority. A fire lit up his eyes, and he stepped forward, ready to remove Daniel from this unworthy woman. "Have you forgotten where your place is, Daniel?" he said menacingly. "Don't you dare interfere." But Daniel could no longer stand aside. On the other hand, he knew that if he did not intervene now, this violence would continue, and not only with this woman. Deep down, he felt that this situation could become decisive in his career, and perhaps even in his life. "You've turned this area into a fear zone," Daniel replied, his voice firm. "I won't let you do that. You have no idea how many people are suffering because of your hatred. This isn't a law, this is oppression." As if in response to his determination, the woman raised her head, her eyes meeting Daniel's. She saw something in them that she hadn't seen in a long time: compassion and a willingness to fight. It was like the light in the dark tunnel that she had been looking for. "I will fight," she said quietly, but with strength, and it gave her courage. I can't let this go on. The racist cop, watching their interaction, began to panic. His vulnerability was revealed in his confusion as he realized that his place in this hierarchy of power could be challenged. He took a determined step back, and immediately a wicked grin appeared on his face. "You're just merging with her, Daniel. She's not important. You can't save everyone," he hissed, trying to maintain his superiority, but his voice was shaking with uncertainty. "She's important," Daniel insisted. "Everyone is important. And you're just a wimp disguised as a cop." The racist's lips tightened into a wicked grin, realizing that he had lost control of the situation. He turned to the woman, and the hatred in his eyes flared up again. "I'll show you what it means to be nobody." He stepped closer, but at that moment Daniel stood between them like an unyielding wall. "Stop! I won't let you do this." His voice sounded determined. Silence fell over the stage. They stood facing each other, each convinced that they were right. But for the woman, this fight was more than just a fight between two men. It was a fight for her life and the life of her child, for justice that seemed to be slipping away. "Daniel," she said, her voice full of hope. "Help me. Help us." In that moment, something formed between them, a bond of common purpose that transcended all fears and prejudices. Daniel felt his resolve strengthen. He was no longer just a cop, he was a protector, ready to stand up for those the system tried to suppress. "I won't leave you," he said, turning to the woman. "We'll do this together." But the racist cop, not realizing that his time was numbered, exploded again. "I will get you, and mark my words, you will not be able to hide." He bared his teeth like a beast, threatening with soulless hatred. But just as he was about to attack her again, footsteps were heard in the distance. The patrolman who had been on other calls began to approach. The feeling of fear that had been weighing her down for a long time finally gave way to hope. "There will be more people here soon," Daniel said, not taking his eyes off the racist. "You better leave." The policeman, realizing that his dominance was beginning to crumble, cast a last hateful glance at the woman before turning and quickly walking away. Her heart sank in fear, but at the same time she felt lighter. Now she knew that she was not alone, that she had support. Daniel, standing next to her, extended his hand to her, and she, struggling to her feet, grabbed his wrist. In that moment, an invisible connection was forged between them, a promise of support in the fight against systemic oppression. "You're strong," he said, and it wasn't just a compliment, but an acknowledgement of her struggle, her strength, and "you're not alone." They stood there, knowing that they had a long road to justice ahead of them, but they were ready for this fight, together. The sky darkened, as if foreshadowing an impending storm. Daniel stepped between the racist and the pregnant woman, filled with determination and adrenaline. This was the decisive moment. He knew the situation could escalate at any moment, and he couldn't let this police officer break her. "You think you can get away with this so easily?" Daniel growled, not taking his eyes off his partner. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, and he knew he had to act decisively. "We can't turn a blind eye to things like this." The woman on the ground slowly tried to rise, her face twisted in pain. She looked at Daniel with gratitude, but also with horror. She knew that at this moment their lives were hanging by a thread. Every second could be the last, and she felt the fear rising in her again. "Please help me," she said, her voice shaking with tension. "I can't leave my child." The racist policeman noticed her weakness and felt confident, like a predator sniffing its prey. He stepped forward, demonstrating his strength and power. "You think that white bastard is going to protect you?" he said contemptuously, his words sounding like a hiss. "You're not important. You're just another statistic. I can do anything to you." Daniel, feeling anger building inside him, stepped forward to protect the woman. "Don't you dare touch her," he shouted, his voice filled with fury like thunder. "This isn't just a civilian. This is a mother. She carries life within her." The racist exploded in rage, his face turning red. He wasn't going to back down. This was a test for him. He couldn't let his partner look like a hero, especially in front of a woman he considered worthless. "Look how scared she is." He pointed at the woman, who was clutching her stomach and shaking with fear. "Look at her face. She's not a threat. She's just a victim." At that moment, she felt her inner being begin to rise like a fire about to burst into flames. Her fear began to intertwine with anger. She knew she had to do something to stop this violence. "I will not remain silent," she shouted, Despite everything, her voice was full of strength. "You cannot kill my hope. I am a woman, and I deserve respect." Daniel turned to face her, and his eyes met hers. He saw her struggling, trying to be strong despite her vulnerability. That look filled him with determination. He knew he had to keep fighting, not just for her, but for everyone who suffered from similar oppression. "You're right," he said, turning to the racist. "We deserve respect, and I won't let you ruin that." But the racist, losing control, rushed forward, and his fist was already ready to strike again. He swung, but Daniel, anticipating his actions, managed to intercept his hand, holding him in place. "That's not how it works," he screamed, suppressing the growing rage that was pounding in his chest. "You have no right to do this." Both police officers found themselves in a hopeless situation. The conflict that had flared up became a spectacle that attracted the attention of passers-by. People began to gather around, their looks full of shock and bewilderment. Some began to take out their phones, recording everything that was happening on cameras. This created additional tension, because the racist understood that his actions were now in plain sight. "You can't get away with this," one woman from the crowd shouted. Her voice was full of anger. "You must answer for your actions." That single word, spoken with hatred, seemed to ignite a fire that was still burning in Daniel's heart. He felt hope ignite inside him, and he was ready to fight not only for this woman, but for everyone who had ever suffered such abuse. The racist began to panic, realizing that his control over the situation was slipping away. He tried to break free again, but Daniel held him tightly and was not going to let go. "You can't just leave." His voice was determined. "I won't watch you oppress her. It's not just a crime, it's racism." The woman, feeling the support, rose to her feet, her fear beginning to dissipate. She took a step forward, pressing her hand to her stomach, and looked into Daniel's eyes. In that look she saw strength, support, and it gave her hope. "I will fight," she said with a firmness that surprised even herself. "I will not let this continue. I am not alone." The cop, realizing his time was running out, darted away, but Daniel, without thinking, lunged after him. He was not going to let this racist get away, as if he could escape the consequences of his actions. "You will not escape justice," Daniel shouted as they walked out into the street, and he sensed that this was not just a fight between two police officers. This was a battle for the future, for every voice that had ever been suppressed. The cries of passers-by echoed around, creating an atmosphere of unity. People began to gather, supporting the woman, encouraging her, as if they were part of something bigger than just the incident. Each of them felt their role in this fight. "You are not alone," one man shouted, his words echoing through the crowd. "We are here to support you." But the racist, losing control, tried to break free again, his face contorted with anger. He cast a hateful glance at the woman, and this awakened a new surge of strength in her. "I'm not afraid of you," she cried, her voice resonating in the air like a bell ringing in the silence. "You won't break me." The crowd full of people standing by her side only spurred her confidence. She knew that everyone watching her were more than just spectators. They were people who understood her struggle, her fears, and her hopes. At this point, Daniel finally grabbed the racist's hand, preventing him from leaving, and under his protection, she felt safe, but at the same time, her heart sank at the thought of losing her child. This fear, fueled by the impending threat, rolled in waves. Those gathered in the crowd began to shout loudly, calling for justice. They were ready to support her, ready to fight with her. Each cry became a ray of light in a dark world where racism and violence reigned supreme. "We are with you," someone from the crowd shouted, and this voice became a symbol of hope, the personification of a force that can destroy even the strongest walls of hatred. The racist, feeling his world crumbling, froze, realizing that the only way left for him was to run. He turned and tried to disappear into the crowd, but Daniel wouldn't let him. "I won't let you get away," he shouted, and there was a determination in his voice that made everyone in the crowd freeze. The moment Daniel grabbed the racist's wrist, the tension in the air became almost palpable. Every heart in the crowd beat in unison with her fear, and she knew that this was not just a fight between police officers, this was a fight for her life, the life of her unborn child. Outside, there were voices encouraging her, but inside, terror was growing. She placed her hands on her stomach, as if protecting it from the threat of the policeman, who seemed willing to do anything to prove his strength. "Don't do this," "You can't hurt my baby," she screamed, her voice shaking with fear. Every word was full of desperation, as if her baby's very life depended on this moment. She felt her stomach tighten with worry, and tears began to well up in her eyes. At that moment, the racist clenched his jaw, looking at her with hatred, his eyes blazing with evil. "How dare you threaten me? You are worthless." His voice resembled the whistle of a snake ready to attack. He wanted her to feel vulnerable, and this took the last of his patience. Daniel, feeling the growing threat, stood between the woman and the racist like a shield. He understood that at such a moment, every wrong step could cost her and her child their lives. "Don't you dare touch her," he exclaimed, his voice loud enough to be heard not only by those present, but also by the cars driving by. "She's pregnant. You can't do this." But the racist, ignoring Daniel's words, began to approach the woman. Fear overwhelmed her, and she stepped back, pressing her hands to her stomach. "I just want her to understand who's boss here," the racist growled, his steps getting closer. It was like a predator slowly approaching, ready to strike the final blow. The crowd, realizing that things were getting critical, began to shout even louder. Every voice was filled with horror, but also anger. People began to step forward, creating a kind of barrier between the woman and her aggressor. "Don't let him get near her," one of the men shouted, his voice full of rage. People began to squeeze into a tight circle, and this unity created an atmosphere full of determination and support. Daniel kept his eyes on the racist, his heart pounding with tension. Every moment could be crucial. He knew that if this man decided to attack, he would have to react quickly. Thoughts flashed through his mind that this might not only be a physical fight, but a fight for the future, for everyone who had ever suffered from oppression. "I won't let you do this," Daniel said with determination, but at the same time, his inner voice whispered fears. What if he couldn't protect her? What if he didn't have the strength? He knew that not only her life was at stake, but also the life of her unborn child. The woman, feeling fear consuming her, raised her head and looked at Daniel. There was not only panic in her eyes, but also hope. It was the only thing that kept her strong. "Please," she said, her voice full of emotion. "I'm afraid for my child. Help me." That simple plea was the signal to Daniel that he had to act. He looked at her, and in that moment they knew they had to fight together. Their strengths were united by a common goal, to survive and preserve the future. The racist, seeing that his threat was losing its force, shouted again, but this time his voice sounded weak, as if he himself realized that he was losing control of the situation. "You're just a girl. You don't know anything." There was panic in his voice. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." But the racist's words couldn't stop her. She took a step forward. Her voice became stronger. "I know who I am. I know I'm a mother," she said, her courage surprising herself. "You won't break me. I will protect my child." This statement was a catalyst. Daniel felt a wave of power rise up inside him. He stood next to the woman, ready to protect her. "You can't just get away with it," he cried, his voice louder than ever. "We won't let this racism continue." The crowd, captivated by his words, began to chant. Every word echoed in the hearts of the people, and they seemed to become one. "No to racism, protect her," came the cries, and this voice of unity made even the racist feel fear. His confidence was fading, and doubts began to flicker in his eyes. He had not expected the crowd to gather around them, that all these people would witness his atrocities. At that moment, his behavior became not only an echo of aggression, but also a reflection of his internal struggle. "You don't know what you're doing," he screamed, feeling his place in this world begin to crumble. "You're just a black woman. Who are you to challenge me?" His words caused a reaction in the crowd. People began to step forward, ready to stand up for her. Each of them understood that this fight was not just about one woman, but about everyone who had ever faced racism and violence. The woman, feeling supported and united, took another step forward. She realized that her voice mattered. Every cry from the crowd became her own cry. "I am a mother. I have the right to life and protection." Her words rang out louder than ever, and this became a new beginning for her fight. She could not let this policeman, this racist, take her future away from her. At that moment, when the fear began to recede, she realized that she was no longer alone. Her strength increased, and she stood with her head held high, ready to fight not only for herself, but also for her child. She knew that it would be a long road, but now she had support, and she was not going to give up. The situation was heating up to the limit. The crowd around the woman and Daniel grew. Their support felt like a powerful stream that was ready to sweep away any evil that stood in their way. Every voice, every movement became parts of a single mechanism striving for justice. The racist, realizing he had lost control, turned sharply and bolted away. But Daniel wasn't about to let him get away. He grabbed him by the shoulder and spun him back toward the woman, his face full of determination. "Where are you going? You can't just run away from your actions," Daniel yelled, squeezing the racist's hand so tightly that he couldn't break free. "Let me go! You don't understand who you're dealing with," the racist screamed, trying to free himself. There was panic and anger in his voice, mixed with the knowledge that his time was running out. The woman, looking at this scene, felt how the fear gradually retreated. She understood that her support, the forces around her, were able to change the course of events. "I won't be afraid anymore," she cried, her voice confident. "I'm not alone, and I won't let this go on." The crowd responded to her words with a loud cheer. People began chanting, "Justice! No to racism!" Their cries were full of determination, as if the heavens themselves were responding to their call. At that moment, the racist realized that his hatred wasn't just destroying lives, it was creating walls that people would band together to break down. He tried to shout something else, but his voice had lost its power. "It's none of your business. I'm a policeman. I'm above you," he breathed out, his voice no longer sounding so confident. "Above whom?" asked one woman from the crowd. "You are not above us, when there are so many of us." The crowd roared with support. Daniel, feeling the growing unity, looked back at the woman. He saw a light in her eyes, a light of hope and strength. "Are you ready?" he asked, looking at her confidently. She nodded, and that was all he needed. "Together we can change this," he said, raising his voice so everyone around him could hear. "We are here to show that hate will not win. We will not be silent." The crowd screamed again, and each scream was like a hammer striking an anvil, creating a new future, a new society free of hatred. But the racist, losing the last vestiges of control, suddenly pulled his wrist away and rushed towards the woman. Full of rage, there was no longer fear in his eyes, only blind hatred. "I'll do to you what I've always wanted to do," he growled, stepping towards her. But at that moment Daniel grabbed him sharply, not allowing him to get closer. He felt the adrenaline boiling in his veins, and he was not going to back down. "You can't scare her, much less touch her," he shouted, his voice filled with rage. "You have no right to threaten her or her child." The crowd, seeing the racist trying to attack again, became even more active. People began to take steps forward, creating a solid line between the aggressor and the woman. They became a united front, protecting her like a wall that could stop evil. "Don't let him get close," one of the men shouted, his face full of determination. "We won't let you do that," the other woman added, her voice full of fury. Each of them understood that this fight was not just about protecting one woman. It was a battle for all those who had ever faced oppression and racism. It was a fight for human rights, for a future free of hate. A woman stood at the center of this movement, her heart swelled with pride and hope. She knew that her child would grow up in a world where people were willing to fight for justice. She raised her head, and a spark of determination lit in her eyes. "We will win," she shouted, and that was another catalyst. Every person around her shouted back, creating a wave of unity that swept through the crowd. At this point, the racist, feeling his strength fading, began to retreat. He realized that he could not win, and every step back was a crushing blow to his pride. "You're all just a mob," he shouted, his voice growing weak. "This won't end. You won't win." But Daniel and the crowd ignored his threats. They knew this was a defining moment. They knew they were part of something bigger. Their united voice was a force that could change the world. "It will end when you learn to respect," Daniel shouted, and there was a confidence in his voice that gave hope. The crowd screamed again, and in that moment, as the fear began to subside, the woman felt that her strength, her courage, was now connected to each of them. They were ready to fight for their truth, for their lives, and for the future. The racist, seeing that he was losing control, stumbled and began to retreat, but the crowd did not let him go. This was not just a spectacle, it was a display of power that could break the chains of hatred. "We are together," the woman shouted, and her words became a symbol of unity. The crowd responded, and this cry became a new beginning, a new stage in their struggle. They stood as one, ready to fight for truth and justice, ready to change the world. The situation continued to escalate as the racist began to realize that the crowd was not going to back down. His eyes darted around and he felt fear grip him. This was not just a conflict. It was a real war between hate and love, between oppression and freedom. "You're all going to get into trouble," he shouted, his voice shaking with rage. But inside him, a sense of hopelessness was growing. Panic was reflected in his eyes, and he began to realize that his hatred could turn against him. The crowd, emboldened by the woman's courage, became increasingly aggressive. They began to approach the racists, their faces full of determination and anger. Daniel walked forward, feeling the adrenaline blazing through his veins. He knew that this moment was everything. "You will not escape responsibility," he shouted, and his words echoed like thunder. "We will not allow you to hurt innocent people." But the racist, feeling the ground slipping from under his feet, suddenly pulled a pistol from his pocket. Fear pierced the crowd. People froze. Their screams died in their throats. Everyone knew that this could be the beginning of a tragedy. "I will make you shut up," he shouted, his voice sharp and cold as a steel blade. His hand was shaking, but he could not allow himself to show weakness. The woman felt her heart skip a beat. She pressed her hands to her stomach, realizing that at that moment her life and the life of her unborn child were in danger. "No, please don't shoot," she screamed, her voice shaking with fear. "You can't do this." But the racist just grinned. A mad sparkle appeared in his eyes. He felt the power of hatred overflowing him, and he was ready to go to the end. "Why don't you all disappear?" he hissed, his voice a whisper of evil. "I'm not afraid of you." At that moment, people began to slowly retreat. Fear filled the space. Everyone knew that one shot could be the beginning of the end. Daniel, looking into the racist's eyes, knew he couldn't just stand there and wait. He had to act. "Don't you dare do that," he shouted, stepping forward. "We're not afraid of you." The crowd, sensing his determination, gathered around him again. Together they began to take steps forward, though fear still gripped their hearts. "We're here to support her," one woman screamed, her voice like a hammer, breaking the chains of fear. "You can't intimidate us," added the other man, his eyes blazing with anger. The racist, feeling pressure from all sides, began to panic. His hand was shaking and he did not know what to do. "I'll do it," he growled, and there was hysteria in his voice. But the crowd kept coming, like a wave ready to sweep away everything in its path. Daniel did not retreat. His gaze remained focused on the racist. He understood that this was not just his fight. This was a fight for the future, for a world where hatred would no longer have power. And then, when the racist raised his gun, there was a crack, not a shot, but an explosive sound that echoed throughout the area. It was a sound that made people freeze in horror. "No!" the woman screamed, her face pale with fear. She pressed her hands to her stomach again, her mind full of panic. But suddenly there were shouts from behind the racist. The police, hearing the noise and shouts, arrived at the scene. They surrounded him, their faces full of determination and readiness for action. "Drop your weapon," one of the policemen shouted, his voice stern and confident. The racist, realizing he was trapped, suddenly tried to run, but it was too late. People around him started chanting, "Justice! No to racism!" Their voices were powerful as thunder. Daniel felt a wave of excitement wash over him, and he knew that this situation could still turn into tragedy. "Stop him!" he shouted, pointing at the racist who was rushing around trying to find a way out. The police, seeing his movement, rushed forward. In an instant, they grabbed the racist and threw him to the ground. His gun slipped from his hands, and everything around him became quiet again. The woman stood, her heart pounding, but she no longer felt fear. She felt supported now, and that was what she needed to gain strength. "We did it," she whispered, her eyes filling with tears, but they were tears of joy. But as soon as the police had the racist under control, he looked her in the eye and said angrily, "You still don't understand that I'm the boss here. This is not the end." His words were laced with hatred, and although he was restrained, his eyes still burned with malice. As they took him away, whispers began to form in the crowd, fear beginning to creep in again. People were beginning to realize that this wasn't just a fight against one racist. This was a fight against a system, against a mentality that was slumbering among them. "What happens next?" one of the women whispered, her voice trembling with fear. "We can't stop," Daniel replied, his face full of determination. This is just the beginning. The flame inside the woman lit up again. She knew this was not the end. This was her life, her child's life, and she was not going to give up. We will fight for our future, she shouted, and it became a new call to action. The crowd gathered again, their voices blending into one. Fear no longer held them back. They became a united front, ready to fight for justice and for the right to live in a world without hatred. The moment they raised their hands in the air, they realized that this would not just be a fight, this would be a movement that would change everything. As the racist was led away into a police car, the woman felt the adrenaline drain from her body. The crowd was still around her, chanting words of encouragement, but inside her, confusion and fear reigned. She could not shake the feeling that the shadow of racism would haunt her forever, and this feeling became almost unbearable. The moment she released her tension, a wave of terror hit her with renewed force. She knelt down, pressing her hands to her belly, where her unborn child was. Pain shot through her like cold needles, and she bit her lip to keep from screaming. "Please, baby, hold on tight," she whispered, her voice shaking with tears. "I won't let it end like this." The events of the last few minutes were running through her mind. Every moment, every threat, every blow, she knew that all of this would leave a mark on her soul and on the soul of her child. Suddenly, fear gripped her. What if this horror affected her baby? The crowd around her was still chanting, but her world was crumbling. She felt fear seeping into every cell of her body, and in that moment, she felt like she was in a nightmare with no way out. She looked up and saw people looking at her with concern and support. She caught a spark of hope in their eyes. These strangers, these comrades ready to fight for her, this was what she needed most right now. "You are my strength," she said, her voice becoming more confident. With every word she said, she felt her fear begin to fade. She knew that she had to be strong now, not just for herself, but for her child. No matter how much evil was around her, she couldn't let it win. At that moment, one of the women from the crowd approached her, her face full of compassion. "How are you?" she asked, her voice gentle as warm sunlight. I don't know," the woman replied, her voice shaking. "I'm just afraid it will affect my baby." A woman from the crowd leaned toward her and placed her hand on her shoulder. "You are not alone," she said. "We are with you. We will fight for you and for your child. You are stronger than you think." These words became a reminder to her that she was not alone. She would do everything in her power to protect her baby from the darkness that surrounded them. Despite her fear, her spirit gradually began to recover. She stood up, and her heart was filled with determination. "I will fight as long as I have strength," she said loudly, and it became her mantra. As the racist was led away, she felt the fire within her rekindle, but at the same time, new fears arose. How would the world treat her child? What if this fear of hatred and racism eventually reached him? Several days passed, but the shadow of the incident remained with her. She often woke up from nightmares in which she saw the face of the racist again and again. In these moments, it seemed as if her heart was breaking with pain. She felt how her baby responded to her emotions every time she was worried. He twitched, as if he too was afraid. One night, when she woke up again in a cold sweat, she felt her baby kicking in her belly. It was unexpected, but at the same time amazing. "Do you want to fight too?" she whispered, placing her hand on her stomach. "You can be strong, like me." This thought became a comfort to her. She decided that she would not let this fear take over. Instead, she began to prepare for the birth of her child by creating a space filled with love and warmth around her. She contacted a local organization that helped abused mothers and began attending support groups. These meetings became a source of strength for her. She learned that her story was not unique. Many other women had faced similar horrors, all of them looking for a way to rebuild their lives. She began writing in a journal, describing her fears and worries, pouring out her emotions on paper. It helped her process what had happened. Every page, every word became a step toward healing for her. She became more and more confident with each passing day. She realized that her child also felt her inner struggle and strength. She began to imagine how her baby would grow up in a world where love and justice prevailed over hatred. But there was still anxiety inside her. She knew that fear could be contagious, and she needed to find a way to create a safe space for her baby. She decided that she would talk to him even before he was born. "I will love you and protect you," she whispered, stroking her belly. "You will never be alone. We will get through this together." And at that moment, she felt her baby reacting again. It was as if he was responding to her words, and it gave her strength. She knew that together they could overcome any difficulties. However, the shadow of that incident continued to haunt her. Every night she would wake up from nightmares, and sometimes she would even hear screams from her dreams. She tried to focus on her future, but the fear was still there, a constant reminder of what they had been through. Time passed, and the day came when she went to give birth. As she stood in the delivery room, she felt her fears begin to dissolve. There were medical professionals around her ready to help, and she knew she was safe here. When her baby finally came into the world, she felt all the pain and fear disappear. Her baby cried out, a cry full of life and hope. She held him in her arms, and in that moment, all her fears and worries seemed insignificant. "You are my light," she whispered, hugging him. "I will protect you and love you as long as I live." But there was still room in her heart for worry about how the world would perceive her child. She knew this was just the beginning of their fight, but now she had a new goal, not just to survive, but to create a world where her child could grow up free from hatred and fear. From that day on, she promised herself that she would fight to change the world around her. Starting with her baby, she knew that her story would not end until they achieved justice and equality. She was ready to fight for her child and for a future in which there would no longer be room for hatred. With each day spent with the newborn, the woman felt her life changing. She named her baby Adon, which translated means first land. This name symbolized for her the hope for a new beginning and the opportunity to create a world for her son free of hatred and fear. The first days after the birth were filled with joy, but she was also tormented by thoughts about how to raise her son in a society where racism and prejudice still existed. Every night, as she rocked Adon in her arms, she whispered to him, "You are my love, my light, we will go through all the trials together." However, despite her confidence, fear still lingered. She felt like every move Adon made was a reminder of what she had been through, and that she needed to be prepared to protect him from a world that could be cruel. When Adon was a month old, the woman decided they should go out together. She enrolled in a course teaching women how to cope with trauma and realized it was not only necessary for her, but also for her baby. She knew it was important to be active and show Adon that they could change the world, even if it seemed bleak. Every morning, when she wrapped Adon in a warm blanket and took him for a walk, her heart filled with hope. She wanted him to see the world in all its colors and shades, so that he would grow up understanding that his life mattered. One day, while walking in the park, she came across a group of parents playing with their children. Her heart sank as she saw them laughing and enjoying the simple joys of life. "Hello," she greeted, trying to look confident, although fear still lurked deep in her soul. "What's your baby's name?" one of the women asked, smiling. "It's Adon," she replied, looking at her son, who seemed to sense her anxiety. "What a beautiful name," said another woman. "We call ours Eddie. Come join us." The woman hesitated, but finally agreed. She sat down next to the other parents, and gradually the fear began to subside, giving way to a friendly atmosphere. "How do you cope with childbirth?" asked one of the women. "It's hard sometimes," she admitted, "but I try to be strong for him." "Strong for him?" the other asked with interest. "Why do you need that? He's little." "I have to protect him," she said, her voice filled with determination. "I want him to know that his life matters. I don't want him to grow up in a world where hatred defines his existence." Her words struck a chord with other parents. They began sharing their fears and hopes, talking about the challenges of being a parent in a world full of prejudice. The revelation brought them closer together, and the woman felt her heart fill with warmth. Every day, she became more confident in her role as a mother. She began to study books about racism and how to raise children with understanding and respect for differences. She read Adana's stories about great people fighting for justice, and she knew that this was what she wanted to pass on to her son. One night, when she was reading him a bedtime story, he seemed especially attentive. He looked at her with his big, curious eyes, and she felt him understand her words, as if he sensed her love and her desire to protect him from all the bad things in the world. "You are our future," she said, stroking his head. "I will always be there to let you know that you are important and that you can do anything." However, one day, when she was returning from the store with Adon, a shadow of the past overtook her. She saw a familiar face. It was the racist who had once attacked her. His gaze was full of hatred and contempt. "What are you doing here?" he hissed, looking at her and her son. Her heart began to beat faster, but she tried to remain calm. She pulled Adon close, feeling him begin to twitch from her tension. "I'm just going home," she replied, trying to sound confident, even though a storm was raging inside her. "You think you can be here with this creature?" His voice was filled with contempt. At that moment, her fear turned to rage. She knew she couldn't let this man intimidate her and her son. "He is my son," she said, her voice loud and firm, "and he is important. He deserves a better world." Her words hung in the air, and at that moment she felt Adon calm down. He began to listen to her voice, feeling her confidence. The racist looked at her as if he couldn't believe his ears. "Do you think I'll scare you?" he growled. "No," she replied, her fear becoming strength. "You are nothing, and I will not let you intimidate us." As if in response to her determination, Adon began to move again. It was as if he knew that his mother was ready to fight for him. "You will never win," she screamed, confident that she was right. For a moment they stood facing each other, and the woman felt her fear begin to fade. She knew she was not alone, that she had support, her son, who would grow up in a world where hatred would have no power. When the racist finally turned away and walked away, she felt her heart fill with pride for what she had done. She hugged Adon and whispered in his ear, "We did it, baby. We can do anything." This meeting was a defining moment for her. She realized that she now had the power not only to protect herself, but also to pass this power on to her son. She decided that she would continue to fight to show Adon that the world was full of love and opportunity, despite the hatred. From that day on, she became an activist, going to rallies and participating in discussions. She spoke about her experiences and the importance of creating a safe space for all children. Adon became her companion at all these meetings, and she felt him growing up surrounded by people who were ready to support them. Every time she held him in her arms, she felt that it was not just her fight, but their fight. She hugged him, looked into his eyes and said, "You are our light. We will make the world a better place for you." Adon, as if feeling her words, smiled and laughed again. His laughter was a reminder that despite everything they had been through, life goes on and there is always hope. And every day when she woke up next to him, she knew that she was ready to fight for him, for his future, and for all those who needed protection and support. They were stronger together, and this gave her confidence that they could overcome any obstacles. As time went by, each day spent with Adon became a new lesson and a source of strength for her. She watched him grow, and his smile always gave her confidence. Adon became not only her son, but also her hope for a better future. One day, when Adon was 3, they attended a rally to combat racism and discrimination. The woman held his hand, and she saw genuine interest in his eyes. He looked at the people around him, families, friends, strangers, and felt an atmosphere of unity. "Mom, why are they shouting?" he asked, pointing to the crowd chanting slogans about justice. The woman leaned towards him, hugging him tighter. "They're screaming to be heard, to show that we're all important and deserve to be treated equally," she replied, her heart filling with pride that she could explain that to her son. "Am I important too?" Adon asked with innocent curiosity. "Yes, you are the most important thing I have," she said, leaning down to kiss his forehead. "You and all the children in this world are important, and we must do everything we can to ensure that they grow up in a world where they are valued." This moment became a symbol for her. She knew that they were going in the right direction. When the rally ended, she felt hope rekindled in her heart. She looked at her son, who was watching with delight as the fireworks began to explode in the sky. The fireworks represented everything she had fought for: light, life, and opportunity. The woman decided that her mission was now not only to protect her child, but also to help others. She became an active participant in local communities, organizing events aimed at educating about the importance of equality and respect for everyone, regardless of skin color or origin. She knew that fear and hatred would not disappear overnight, but she believed that together they could create a world where her son and all children would feel safe and loved. Every step she took, every voice she raised, was a step toward the future she dreamed of. As Adon grew, his faith in justice blossomed with him. He began to ask important questions, to participate in discussions, and this filled her with pride. She knew that by raising him with love and understanding, she was helping to shape a new generation that would fight for the truth. Adon started school. The woman realized that their relationship with society was changing. She worked to create an environment for her son where he could be supported, where he could be himself. And looking at him, she realized that everything they had been through had only strengthened their bond and given them strength. The day came when Adon went to school for the first time. She held his hand as they walked through the threshold of the school. "Are you ready?" she asked, smiling. "Yes," he answered enthusiastically. "Remember, you are special and you can change the world," she reminded him, looking into his eyes. "I will," Adon said confidently. She looked at him, feeling pride and hope. With that thought, she turned and walked out of the school, knowing that their fight would now continue through a new generation. This story of love, pain and struggle became a symbol of their lives. The woman knew that her son was not alone in his journey, and despite all the trials, their connection would be their strength, and their love, their protection. She turned her gaze to the sky where the fireworks were blazing again, and a realization blossomed in her heart. This was only the beginning. Adon and her dreams for a better future would live on in their hearts and in the actions they would take, because they both knew the world could change, and they were part of that change. The woman paused, looking at her life, filled with challenges and joys. She felt how all the experiences had made her stronger, and looking at Adon, she realized that their story was just beginning. With this thought, she returned to her son, who, confident and full of enthusiasm, was walking towards new opportunities. Every day was an opportunity for them to learn, grow, and change the world for the better. She knew that together they could overcome any obstacle. A flame of hope lit up her heart and a light of love lit up her eyes. And as they walked down the school corridor, she whispered to him, "You are our light, and you can do everything." Adon, turning to face her with a wide smile, simply nodded, full of confidence and readiness. Their life story, filled with fear, pain and love, became not only their own path, but also a light for others who needed hope. And so, under the rays of the rising sun, they both continued on their way, knowing that in their hands was the future, bright, free and full of opportunity. And thank you for being with us and following this touching story. We are very interested to know your opinion. What do you think about what happened to the heroine? Have you ever experienced racism in your life? And how did you deal with it? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your opinion is very important to us. We appreciate each of you and are truly grateful for your support. You are our big and important family, and every word you say inspires us to do more. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and like the video if you enjoyed it. Have a great day and see you soon.